Learning how to write Markdown is incredibly important. It's used everywhere from Reddit's comment systems, GitHub's READMEs, documentation, blog articles, and so much more. So in this video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about Markdown, and if you want, I have a completely free Markdown cheat sheet I'm going to link down in the description for you that covers everything you need to know about Markdown with visual examples. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And today I'm going to be talking all about Markdown. Now the very first thing I want to mention, I do have a Markdown cheat sheet for you. As you can see here, it covers everything you need to know about Markdown. It has tons of examples, super visual. I even have a light version of it if you prefer to burn your eyes out. That's going to be linked down in the description for you. Also, I have a full blog article covering this, and in this blog article, I have interactive examples so you can mess around with any of the code and see exactly what it renders off to the side. I think this is probably the best way to look at and to learn Markdown. Now, before I start talking about Markdown itself, I kind of want to show you an example of how Markdown is used. Here's the actual GitHub repo for my blog. You'll notice there's a README inside of it. I haven't done anything to it. It's just the default Astro README. But you notice it has all this really nice formatting. Everything looks really clean and professional. And if I look at the actual code for this, you'll notice it's using essentially Markdown. All of this is written in Markdown, and it has this different syntax you can use to essentially format things exactly as you want. So as you can see, this doesn't look super pretty, but as soon as we actually look at the rendered version of it, it looks really good and clean. And all it took was a little bit of code to make something that looks so good. So now let's actually talk about Markdown. On the right-hand side, I have that blog article that I talked about. We're going to be using that quite a bit in this video. And on the left-hand side, I have Visual Studio Code open. And the reason I have it open is because they actually give you a way to preview Markdown. So if I close out of this preview, I just have a file. And if you end a file in .md, that stands for Markdown, that is going to make this a Markdown file. And if you want to view a preview, if you type Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P on a Mac, you're going to get the command palette here. And if you just search for Markdown, you'll notice this one called Open Preview to the side. If you click on that, it'll open up a live preview on the side. So now if I change things on the right, you can see that they automatically update on the right when I change them on the left. So now let's make this a little bit larger and actually talk about what Markdown is. Essentially, Markdown is just a way to format text based on different characters and different ways that you write out the text to make it show up how you want. Generally, Markdown is going to be rendered out as HTML, but you could take a Markdown file and render it out however you want. You could render it to like a PDF, for example, if you wanted to. Now, unfortunately, Visual Studio Code, the text that they actually render out is quite small inside of Markdown. I mean, you can see that it's incredibly tiny, and even when I zoom in, it's still really, really small. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to use my blog because all of my examples on my blog are interactive. And if I scroll to the very bottom of this article, I have essentially a full screen interactive editor that I can use. Anything I type on the left is going to show up on the right. And the nice thing is it's going to be a little bit larger and a little bit easier to see. I even went ahead and bumped up the font size a little bit extra just for this video so you can really see what I'm talking about. Now, the very first thing you need to know about Markdown is just how to write normal text. If we just write out some text, you'll notice when I write out text on the left, it just shows up exactly the same on the right. And that's because by default, when you type in text with nothing else around it, no special characters, it's going to render out essentially a paragraph inside of HTML. So if you're rendering to HTML, by default, this will give you a paragraph. And you can just type whatever you want inside of here, and it's going to render in a paragraph. And if you even put a new line and start typing, it's still going to put that on the exact same line. It'll just treat it as if it was a space instead of an actual new line. If you want to create a new paragraph, you need to separate your old paragraph from your new paragraph by one empty line. And essentially inside of Markdown, anytime you have elements next to each other, you need to separate them by an empty line. Otherwise, you'll run into issues potentially. So pretty much anytime that you want to create multiple paragraphs or separate other elements from one another, just put an empty line in between them, and that's going to give you exactly what you expect. Now, if instead of creating a brand new paragraph, you wanted it to be in the same paragraph, but on an actual new line, the way you would do that is you would just put two spaces at the end of the previous line. So here, if I just come and I just take our code and I'll just say normal text, and then this here, I want to be on a new line, put two spaces on the previous line, and now you'll notice it's on a new line. But if I actually inspect this element, I'm going to bring this over here. You'll notice it's all within inside of one p tag because it's rendering out inside of an actual paragraph tag. The only thing here is I have a line break in between them. That's what that two spaces is doing for me. Luckily, that's not something you're going to super commonly need to do, but it is something you can do. I just really don't like the fact that it's two spaces. It's kind of ugly and hard to see, but that's just what they decided to do. Now, another thing that's really common in Markdown is the need for headings. So for example, if you want to create an H1, the largest possible heading, you would put one pound symbol followed by some text. As you can see, we have heading. And for every pound symbol you add, your headings are going to get smaller and smaller all the way up until you get to 6. You can see here, this is 6, and that's the smallest heading you can have. You'll also notice there's certain styles being applied to this, changing the color and so on. You can add any CSS you want. This just renders out normal HTML, so you can add all your own styles to it to make it work exactly like you want. One kind of interesting thing to note is all the code that you see on this page is actually written inside of Markdown. Every article on my blog is written entirely in Markdown. And if you want, I'm going to be linking this blog in the description, so you can go ahead and play around with this interactive editor yourself if you want. So for example, let's say we wanted to have a main heading, we make it super large, then we make sure we separate it by an empty line, and let's just put some text afterwards. So now we have a heading followed by a paragraph, super straightforward. And then if we wanted a smaller heading, we can put some text after that, and as you can see, it's just working better and better, and it's almost like giving you a perfect document outline. And as you can see, this is really great for things like documentation, blogs, comments, and so on. Now, before we get too much further into all the really cool things you can do with Markdown, one thing I do want to mention is that there's actually different flavors of Markdown. That's what they call them. It's essentially different types of Markdown. So Markdown is a specification that has specific things defined in it, like how do you create headings, how do you create paragraphs. But some people wanted to add on to Markdown because they didn't think there was enough stuff in the base specification. So there are different flavors of Markdown that extend upon that. One of the most common flavors of Markdown is the GitHub flavored Markdown, sometimes called GFM, and this adds a bunch of additional things. There's also other flavors out there that add even more, so when I'm going through this video, I'm going to be mentioning when certain things are from the base spec versus the extended spec, so you know what to expect if you try to use Markdown somewhere where maybe some of these extended features are or are not supported. So far, everything we've covered is in the base specification of Markdown and should work everywhere that you use Markdown. Another thing that's supported everywhere is if you want to bold or italicize text. So let's just say we have some text, and let's say we want to make this word bold here actually be bold. Well, the way you do that is you surround it by 2 of the star symbol, and that's going to give you a bold piece of text. It's a little bit hard to see here if it's bold, but it is actually bolding this text. It just doesn't have much of a difference between the bold and the normal font. Now, another alternative to using the asterisk is you can use double underscore, and that's going to give you the same effect. It's going to give you bold text just like as if you used the asterisk, but generally I recommend using double asterisk just because if you're in the middle of a word, so for example, I wanted to bold just the O here, if I do that with underscores, it may not work as I expect it to, while the double asterisk here is going to work. Now, as for italics, let's say we want to do italics here. What we could do is we could just use one of the asterisks, and now you can see the text is italicized. And same thing here, if we use underscores, exactly the same thing as before. So if you use 2 asterisks or underscores, it'll be bold. 1 asterisk or underscore is going to give you italics. And if you want the text to be both bold and italic, we'll just surround it by 3. And now it's going to be both bold and italic. And the nice thing is you can do the exact same thing with 3 underscores. So if we come in here with 3 underscores, you can see we get the same thing. And we can even mix and match. You can see, for example, here, I'm using underscores for bold and stars or asterisks, sorry, for my italics. And you can see that's working just fine. Generally though, I would recommend just doing one or the other and stick with it for your entire document. And this again is a feature that is supported in the base version of Markdown. Now, all the other text styling specific stuff I want to talk about, they're all going to be in the extended versions of Markdown. So for example here, let's say I wanted to cross some text off. So we're going to say crossed off. Whoops. There we go, crossed off. To do that, you use the double tilde. And if you use 2 tildes like this, that's going to strike through your text. And sometimes it'll even work with just 1 tilde, but I would recommend not doing that because 1 tilde actually has another meaning in specific flavors of Markdown. So here, 2 tildes is going to cross off any text for you. Now, if you want to highlight some text, you need to use double equal sign, and that is going to highlight text for you. But you will notice if I do that here, it doesn't actually work. That's because this is again an extended feature of Markdown, but this is not supported by GitHub's flavor of Markdown, which is what I'm using to render out this Markdown editor right here. But luckily, some versions of Markdown do support HTML. So I could use the mark element, which is an HTML element, that'll give me the exact same feeling. There we go. If I just close that off, you can now see that it is highlighting this text over here by using the mark element, which is what this double equal sign essentially translates to when you actually render it out inside of the proper extended specification. Another specification that does not work at all inside of GitHub's flavor of Markdown is doing super and subscripts. I'm actually just going to copy this text over here real quick and paste it down. And you can see if you want text to be superscripted, essentially it's going to be at the top of a word, you use these caret symbols, just like if you were to write like x to the 2nd power, like this, you just surround it by those carets and that'll make it raise up, or at least it's supposed to. And if you want something to drop down, for example, if you were to write h to O, if you surround it by a single tilde, it should drop that down. Obviously, in this GitHub flavored Markdown, that does not work. So instead, what you can do is you can do this with HTML. So we could use the sup tag, and the sup tag is going to be a superscript. So you can see it makes it small and puts it upward, while the sub tag is going to do the exact same thing, but it's going to make it smaller and go down below. There we go. You can see that 2 in H2O has been dropped down and made smaller. So again, unfortunately, these are not part of the GitHub flavored Markdown specifications, but they are part of other extended specifications. So depending on where you're writing your Markdown, you may actually have access to these or not. But again, a lot of times you have access to HTML, which is great. The final type of text styling that again is not supported in GitHub, but is supported in many Markdown editors is going to be creating emojis. So for example, you could just type in an emoji like this, and if your Markdown editor supports it, it'll actually render out the correct emoji. Unfortunately, GitHub does not support this, but what you can do is you can just copy the actual emoji and paste the emoji into your actual code, and now you can see the emoji is rendering out just fine. So that's the easy workaround for this. Just copy the emoji, paste it into your Markdown, and it should render just fine. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is what happens when you want to render code inside of Markdown. One of the more common use cases for Markdown is showing code, and an easy way to do that is with the backtick key. So what we can do is we can say this is code, and if we want something to be represented as code, which really just means it's monospace, you can surround it by this backtick, and now you can see we get this monospace code looking thing right here. Now if you want, you can add different styles to actually make this look better, but let's just say I said let C equal 10. You can see that this is showing up in a monospace font, while if I remove that, you can see it's no longer monospace. And if you actually look at my blog, there are instances here where I have this code being written out, and you can see I add specific styles around it to make it look a little bit better than just a plain monospace font. Now, if you wanted to have code across multiple lines, the way to do that is with triple backticks. So we can do 3 backticks here, we can do 3 backticks here, and then we can write whatever code we want. We can say like const a equals 10, let y equal 8, and now you can see that we get multiple lines of code, and the nice thing is it supports all your indentation. So if I have like different indentation, all of that is going to be preserved, and it's a really great way to render out code. And again, you can take this even a step further. Most Markdown will support the ability to add the language. So I could type in JS here, and what that'll do is it'll actually give me syntax highlighting for JavaScript. Now this Markdown editor right here does not support that, but for all the code in my blog, I actually do support that. So if we scroll up here a ways, you can see here I have a code block that is for JavaScript code, and I just labeled it as JS just like I did below, and it's giving me proper syntax highlighting for all of the code inside of that code block. So it's important to note that if you do have the ability to use the actual language for your code, I would recommend doing so because again, many editors will actually render out the actual correctly formatted syntax highlighted version of that code, which makes it much easier to read the code. Now, unfortunately, this ability to specify the actual language here, this is part of the extended specification, and even using this triple backticks is again something that is only part of the extended specification. Normally, if you want to actually render something out as code, the way that you do that is by indenting it essentially really far. So if we just indent this a bunch of times, you can see now that this is actually rendered out as code. I don't like the fact that this is how it is by default. I much prefer the backtick method, but that is technically part of the extended specification, but pretty much every Markdown editor will recommend and use that triple backtick syntax because it's so much easier and better to look at. Now for the rest of this article, I kind of want to talk about other types of elements, and specifically these are elements that go a little bit beyond just rendering out text to the screen, even though this first one is not much further beyond it, and that is how do you create a link? Let's say I want to create a link that goes somewhere. As you can see in my blog, I have a bunch of different links all over the place. The way you do that is you put first square brackets, and inside those square brackets, you put the text for your link. So you can say like, this is a link. And then what you do is you put parentheses after that, and inside the parentheses, you put a link. You could make it a relative link, so I could just say like /page, and that'll bring me to /page on my actual page that I'm on. Or you could say that you wanted to go to somewhere like google.com, and now that's going to be a link that brings you to Google. And you can see if I were to right click, open this in a new tab, it's bringing me over to Google. So that's how a link works. You put what you want your link to say inside of square brackets, and inside of parentheses, after that, you put the actual link. Now, one thing that's really nice is if you want to have a link that has the same text as the actual link, you could do this and that'll work. But if you want to make it a little bit easier, what you can do is you can just wrap it inside of these angle brackets. And what that'll do is it'll create a link that goes to the exact same place as this text, and it'll give it the text and the link the exact same place. So you can see if I open this, it again brings me over to Google. Another thing that's really nice is that most extended Markdown editors will allow you just to leave all of this off. And if you just place a link anywhere inside of your Markdown, it'll automatically convert it to a link for you that'll bring you to whatever this URL is. Now again, this ability to leave off all of the formatting, that is only an extended Markdown feature, but again, most editors support it. Now for something that's very similar to links, we have images, and images have the exact same format where we have square brackets followed by parentheses, but the key is here we put an exclamation point in front of our square brackets, and that tells us we're rendering out an image instead. So what we can do inside the square brackets is give our image an alt text. So we could say like Google logo, and that's going to be the actual Google logo. And here I actually have the Google logo downloaded inside of some assets on my website. So you can see this is a relative link to the Google logo, and you can see it's rendering out over here. I could make this a link to somewhere else like an unsplash URL. Whatever this URL is, it just points to an image, and that's the image that's rendered. And then whatever text you put in the square brackets is going to be the alt text for that image. So if I were to inspect this image, you can see here the alt text says Google logo, which is exactly what I put inside of here. Now the next big block that we want to talk about is going to be how do you write out block quotes. So a lot of times you may have a quote for someone else, or you want to kind of like bring attention to a specific piece of text. If you put inside of here an angle bracket, a space, and then some text, you'll notice most often you're going to get some format where you get this left side kind of bar. And then, you know, as long as you just keep having the angle bracket here, you can see that you're constantly bringing down this angle bracket, and all the text that you put inside of it is going to show up off to the side. You can even nest these inside of each other. If you put double angle brackets, you can see this is nested, and we can even go so far as to do like triple nesting and quadruple nesting as many times as you want, which is really cool and really nice. So you want this kind of like block quote syntax, that's how you're going to do it right here. Another really easy thing is syntax is going to be a horizontal rule. So let's say I have some text up here, I have some text down here, and I want to put a line in between them. Well, to do that, there's a few different ways. The first way is put 3 dashes. That's going to give you a line. 3 underscores is going to do the same thing. And 3 stars is also going to do the same thing. So asterisks, dashes, or underlines, as long as you have at least 3. You can see I can put as many asterisks as I want. As long as I have at least 3, it's going to give me a horizontal line. And the key is to make sure you have space before and after that line, just to make sure it renders out. Because sometimes if you don't leave space in between, it may think that you're trying to do like bolding or italics, and it's just not going to work right. So again, I highly recommend that you always make sure you put an empty line in between all your elements inside of Markdown. Now, the final non-extended feature I want to talk about in Markdown is how you render out list. So let's say I have a list of items. Well, I just put 1 and a period, and I can say like item 1, and that's going to give me a list. And I could say that I want item 2, for example, and item 3, and then I just keep going down. I can put any number I want followed by a period, and then whatever your text is after that, make sure I have a space in between them, and that's going to give me a list of those items. And the really important thing is, it doesn't matter what my numbers are. These could all say 1, and it doesn't matter. As long as there's a number followed by a period, it's going to give me a list. As you can see, it gives me a list of 1, 2, 3 off to the side. Now, if I wanted to have an unordered list, instead of putting numbers here, I would essentially use either an asterisk. So here, you can see I have an unordered list. I could use dashes instead, or I could use the plus symbol, and all 3 of these different things of syntax are going to give me the exact same output. It's going to be an unordered list. And if I wanted to nest these inside of each other, I either need to use a tab key or 4 spaces, and then I can continue with this. So I'll say like item 3, and we'll just put some text inside of here, and I can even go further. If I want to do more nesting, just make sure I have those 4 spaces, and there you go, I have more nesting. And I can even make this one an ordered list inside of here. I'll just copy this down real quick so we have another one. And you can see that it's rendering out exactly the same off to the side. So lists are really great because you can do unordered, ordered, any type of nesting you want. However you want to handle your list, it's always going to work exactly as you expect. And I can even come down here and I can continue this other list. So you can see you can get all the list related stuff that you want really, really easily. Now, the last 2 things I want to talk about are going to be extended Markdown features, specifically GitHub extended Markdown features. And the first one is going to be a table. Now, these are quite complex to arrange, so I'm actually going to copy over the code for a table, and it's going to be much easier to see what it looks like if I just copy it over. As you can see here, on the right-hand side, I have a table with 2 columns, and inside those columns, I have some different text, and it has all these different styles being applied for me, which is great. Now, if we look over here on the left-hand side for my code, the very first row of my table, what I have is this pipe symbol is at the very start of my row and at the very end of my row. And every single row I have has to start and end with this pipe symbol. And then in between each column, I put a pipe symbol as well. And then whatever text I want to go in the middle, I just put the text. So here I put column 1, here I put column 2. Now, in between your first row and all your other rows, you want to have essentially a divider, and this divider tells you that this row up here is your header and the rows below it are your normal rows. So here you need to put at least 3 dashes. It doesn't matter how many dashes I put in here, it's going to render out exactly the same as long as I have at least 3. If I have less than 3, things aren't going to work super well. You need to make sure you have at least 3. Generally, when people write these out, they like to put enough that all of your different bars in between your rows line up, so it's a little bit easier to read. But the nice thing is it doesn't matter if those bars line up at all. You can see the output is still exactly the same, and you can see it's actually updating just fine. Then what you do is you just go on and you continue this pattern. You create a bar followed by some text. Make sure you have a pipe in between them, followed by some text, and you'll always end your row with a pipe, and you just do that all the way through. Again, things don't have to line up. You can make them line up to make it a little bit easier to read, but they don't have to. Now, the next thing that you can change is how you actually change the alignment of your different columns. For example, if I want this to be aligned on the right side instead of the left side, I can put a colon on the right-hand side of my dashes, and that's going to right align everything inside this column. If I put a colon on the left side, that's going to left align everything. And if I put a colon on both sides, that is now going to center align everything inside my table. So that's really the only type of customization you can do with tables besides the text inside them, is determining what your alignment is going to be for each one of your rows. So I can make this right aligned and this centered aligned. Now you can see we have right aligned column 1, center aligned column 2. Now this final Markdown feature is much simpler, and it's how you create a checklist or like a task list. What you need to do is you need to create open and close square brackets, and then you put a space in between them to represent that this is an unchecked checkbox. Then you put a space after that and whatever text you want, and the important thing is you need to make sure at the very beginning you have a dash followed by a space. Now you can see here we have a checkbox with some text after it. My checkbox is really small just because I have my font size artificially increased. It would be much more, similar to the font size if I hadn't done that. Now if you want to create a checked checkbox, you do the exact same thing here. But instead of having a space inside of here, you just put an X. Doesn't matter if it's capital or lowercase, it should work fine either way. And then you can see I now have a checked checkbox. And again, if it's capital or lowercase, it does not matter. And that's all the Markdown features you need to know. Again, if you want to check out that cheat sheet, I'm going to have it linked down in the description below, as well as linked in this blog article. And I'll again have this blog article linked below because as you can see, I have interactive examples for every single thing that I talked about. So you can go through and try out every single thing we talked about through all the interactive examples and really deep dive into how Markdown works and really master it for yourself.